Hey, welcome to Next Level Method Podcast. I'm Richard Ryerson.
And I'm Matt Lilly.
And we're here to help you take your life to the next level. Let's get started. Well, Mark Wolynn, welcome to the show. So happy to have you on.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
My curiosity is in overdrive right now.
Mine as well.
Particularly when we're talking about this inherited family trauma. I think I know what that means. I guess it would mean, hey, in your book titled "It Didn't Start With You," I'm dealing with some things, and I've seen this. I was thinking last night. I was laying in bed thinking, some of these things that I keep going back to when I look at these kind of, these negative beliefs or these limitations I have of myself. I'm wondering, is there something genetically within me that kind of drives some of that? I don't know.
Right.
Anyway, what is inherited family trauma? Maybe that's a place.
Yeah. How do we find that?
Like, what is it?
Yeah. So let's say that one of our parents or our grandparents, they went through a pretty significant trauma. Maybe they lost their mothers or fathers when they were young, or maybe our father was sent to boarding school, our mom spent time in foster care. Maybe one of their siblings died tragically, and this diverted the attention that they could get from their parents. A trauma like this, an event like this, can break the heart of the family. Now, inherited trauma is the reaction to this trauma doesn't necessarily stop with the people who experienced it. So the feelings, the sensation, specifically the stress response, the way the genes express, this can pass forward to the children and the grandchildren, affecting them in a similar way with the same trauma response, even though they didn't personally experience the trauma.
And so you just said something there about it affects the genes. So you're saying that basically a past trauma can actually affect the literal, physical, biological genes of that person, and then they can actually pass it forward?
Oh, absolutely. So, when a trauma happens, it changes us. Literally, it causes a chemical change in our DNA. And this will change how our genes function, sometimes for generations. So technically, a chemical tag will attach, after this a terrible event, an epigenetic tag, chemical tag, called many things, will attach to our DNA and tell the cells, hey, because of this terrible thing that just happened, let's use this gene or ignore this gene so we can be better enabled to deal with this trauma that just took place. And then the way that our genes are affected changes how we act or feel. For example, we can become sensitive or reactive to situations that are similar to this trauma, even if this trauma occurred in a past generation. For example, what gets passed forward is this epigenetic response, this adaptation, an altered brain, so that we have a better chance of surviving the trauma in this generation. I'll give you an example. If our grandparents came from a war-torn country, so let's say people are being shot, or bombs are exploding, or uniformed men are lining people up in a square, or people are being taken away, and this was witnessed or this was experienced, our grandparents would develop an alteration. They would develop, let's call it a skill set, which they would pass forward. And in this skill set might be things, responses, maybe sharper reflexes, quicker reaction times, reactions to the violence to help them and us later on survive this trauma. So here they're passing down a system, a skill set to help us survive the trauma they experienced. But the problem is we can also inherit a stress response with the dial set to 10. And here we are preparing for this catastrophe that never arrives. And we rarely make the link that our anxiety, our shutdown, our hypervigilance, our depression is connected to our parents and grandparents. We just think we're wired this way.
Well, technically, I guess we are wired this way then, right? I mean,
Well, yeah. Another way to say it is memories of trauma get imprinted in our parents' and grandparents' sperm cells and egg cells, and then this information passes forward. And as a result, we're born with altered brains, being wired in this way that prepares us to biologically cope with a trauma that's similar to the one they experienced. But when I say that we don't make the link, you're right, we're wired this way, but we don't ever think to consider, to check the events of our parents and our grandparents. We just walk around saying, this is who I am. I'm a guy that when I hear loud noises, my shoulders come in, my chest tightens, I dissociate. But without connecting it to the parents' war, or our father was in Vietnam, without connecting it to his experience.
Yeah, because I'm sorry.
I was just going to, and that's the value then, right? So if I'm sitting there and I'm claustrophobic, and then if I find out and I go, well, because I think the example you gave was, I find out that my grandfather or my father was perished in a gas chamber, I think is the example that you gave. What's the value in that? Okay, so now that I know that, by having that knowledge, now I'm better prepared to deal with my claustrophobia. Is that the way to?
Absolutely. Well, it's not just the knowledge; it's what we do afterwards. So let me expand that just for a minute. So the gas chamber was one example of claustrophobia. Another example: someone drowned or died in a ship that had gone down, or a car that had gone over a bridge. But also a feeling of an infant who has a break in the attachment with his or her mom. That could create a feeling of claustrophobia, of the walls caving in, someone in an incubator. So there's many examples of events that could lead to that symptom. But to speak to your question, absolutely it's helpful. Once you take it out of the realm of, this is just how I am, and we can isolate an event and begin to heal that event and the trauma response connected to that event. So let's say what's passed down is this trauma response where we numb our bodies, we shut down whenever we feel inundated, we feel overwhelmed when we're in a crowd of people. Now we know where it's coming from. That's only a small part of it.
Right.
The next part of it is, how do we heal these what I call defenses or fragmentations or shutdowns that live in the body? They need to be integrated. So when people work with me or work with someone I've trained, we really are integrating the fragmentations, because now we know what to look for. This isn't just me. This is a stress response that I've inherited that needs to heal. Basically, I've got to change my brain's stress response. I've got to downregulate my limbic system.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Oh, just so much stuff here. In a very, as you were, I'm always, we always see things through our lenses, right? So as you're talking, I'm thinking, for some reason, I'm thinking of my grandfather. He served in World War II. I know he served in World War II. There's a story that I've heard that, he, was in World War II, and there was a cave, and they needed to clear the cave, and he fired into the cave, and after the fact, they find out that there's, and I've never told this story before, and I think I've only heard it once from my uncle, but they killed innocent children, right, that were in this cave, and he didn't know that, right? So he cleared this cave, and as you were talking, literally, I'm thinking, would that be affecting me, right? Would that be affecting something?
So it could, depending on your trauma language.
Okay.
For example, so the people who read my book, what they do is I teach them how to become detectives of their verbal and their nonverbal trauma language. Let's say you came to me and said, hey, Mark, I have this feeling I've done something terrible. I've hurt people, or because of me, people died, or I'm a terrible person, I don't deserve to live. Hearing that language, what I would do is I would ask you, who in the family, Matt, Matt, you asked that question, right?
Yeah, I did.
Yes, Matt.
Okay, yeah. Who in the family did something terrible? Who felt guilty? Who made a decision that led to their shutting down, their not talking about it, their drinking,
Yeah.
their disconnection. And because these live in the family history, and often people don't talk about them and they get buried. But then they resurface in the next generation as trauma language, both verbal and nonverbal trauma language. And if you had a sentence like that, Matt, a sentence like, I'm a terrible person, I've done something terrible. Because of me, people died. I don't deserve to live. I could hurt a child. My first question is, who did hurt a child?
Right.
Who did? Yeah, there you go. There you go.
And even though I don't think I used that language, while you were talking about it, I did feel emotion. I felt like sadness. I felt some I felt connected to something that was in that story. So that was, I guess, interesting in the fact that I don't use that language, but yet it's still, I can feel that. And actually, he ended up dying of alcoholism. He came back, drank himself to death, right? Post-World War II.
It would make sense.
Right. And
it would make sense to take the lives of innocent children and to not know that was going to happen, but then to see the aftermath, that would make sense. But the fact that you just told me that you're emotional telling it and talking through this conversation answered your question previously,
which is
why it's important,
me. Right?
And why it's important to talk about these traumas.
Interesting.
To know these traumas. Yeah, exactly.
Because the whole
you're living proof why it's important.
Well, yeah.
And I keep going to remind, because I think it's easy to say, well, you can always say, well, if I know this, so what? What if I do know this? Well, it's because it's a process of self-discovery and healing, right? Because the ultimate objective is healing, right? And what we're professing here is that, or the value of doing all of this is that it gets you to a place of healing. Am I saying that right? Am I hitting all the notes there?
Absolutely. Because we know from neuroscience, we know that to heal, we've got to calm our brain's stress response. Whether we've inherited that stress response or the trauma happened to us, let's say early in our life.
Right.
We've got to have positive experiences that'll change our brain. And then I'll take that a step further. Then we need to have a daily practice of being with the new feelings and the new sensations associated with these positive experiences. Because when we do this, we not only create new neural pathways, we also begin to stimulate the release of feel-good neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, GABA. And we also stimulate the release of feel-good hormones like estrogen or oxytocin. And doing this healing practice, we even can change the genes involved with our body's stress response that can begin to function in a new or an improved way. Basically, what I'm saying is we can change the way our DNA expresses.
It's about breaking the chain. I was just thinking about this, and even on a macro level, I mean, I'm interested in what you think about this, but isn't this the reason why, and I think all of us probably have examples where we see families who just that same cycle just constantly repeats itself. This cycle of dysfunction, or this cycle of micro traumas or even traumatic events, and it just repeats and repeats. And even if you look at the inner cities, like, why isn't the inner city ever changing? It's probably because it's just this big cycle of trauma. I don't know. Does that resonate with you when I say those things, Mark?
Very much. So where you get me here is traumas create a limitation in parenting. So often the reasons why things don't change is because our parents or grandparents have been traumatized in some way. And that affects parenting. That affects what our mother can give, what our father can give. We have to look at not just generational trauma, but we have to look at events that happened early in our early environment that may have caused a break in the bond. Even what happened in utero. What happened when we were in the womb? Did a baby die before us? Was there a baby that was miscarried before us or died stillborn? Was our mother not going to keep us? Were our parents fighting? Drinking? Was someone cheating? Were they separating? Was dad an alcoholic? Was mom not feeling supported? Did she not love our dad? Did she feel trapped? Were they worried about money, food, shelter? There are so many events that can affect our well-being and can affect that brain response. So generational trauma is clearly one. And attachment trauma, trapped. Were they worried about money, food, shelter? There are so many events that can affect our well-being and can affect that brain response. So generational trauma is clearly one. And attachment trauma is clearly another. And to go further, if our grandmother and grandfather experienced misfortune, misery, suffering, that affects what they could give our parents. And that affects what we can get.
Can you give me, I'm curious, you've got to have some real life examples here.
Yes.
I would love to hear some real life examples of where people have made this discovery and then they healed from it.
And how they kind of, if you don't mind, how the steps of kind of, what did you walk them through? How did they actually heal it? Because that's just really interesting to me. It's like, okay, you know it, you have awareness of it, you know it's affecting you somehow, but then what are this, how's it work from there?
Yeah. So I think I'm going to tell the very first case that taught me how to look for inherited trauma. I didn't even put it in the book because it's so, it's heavy.
Right.
So I kept it out of the book, but I think I'm going to tell it here in the interview, only because it will lead the reader, or the listener, through the steps of what happened.
We'd love that.
Here I am 30 years ago, and I don't know anything about inherited trauma. And I'm working with a lot of self-injurers, a lot of cutters, trichotillomania, people who pull their hair, people who burn themselves, people who self-injure. Mm-hmm. And there's one young woman, 24 years old, I'll call her Sarah for the sake of the interview, which is not her name, but I'll call her Sarah. She was 24, and she was cutting her arm, her leg, and her abdomen so deeply that she would hit a vessel and nearly bleed to death. And her parents would have to rush her to the hospital because she would have bled out. And then she's at the hospital, they patch her up, and they put her in a psych ward for 3-4 weeks at a time. Mm-hmm. One day when she had come out and I was working with her, I handed her a pen and I said, "Hey, Sarah, pretend this is your knife and show me exactly what it is you do." So she puts the pen on her arm, brings it close to her skin, and at that minute, I see that she's starting to dissociate. Her eyes are glazing over. I could tell that she was frozen. And I said, "Sarah, right there, what's that thought? What's that feeling? What's that impulse?" And she looks at me and she says, "I don't deserve to live." Here I am looking at a 24-year-old woman whose life has just begun. So I said, "What have you done? Did you accidentally take someone's life? Did you cause an accident? Did you break up with someone who took his life?" She said, "No, nothing like that." So I didn't know what to do. I thought, okay, I'll look in the family history, her mother, her father, her childhood. And that's what I did. She had a great childhood. She adored her mother. She was able to receive her mother's love and nurturance. She adored her dad. She was able to take his love and kindness and care. So I figured it had to be an attachment. So I started to look earlier around the birth and the events in utero. Nothing. She had a solid, safe, secure attachment with her mom. I was flummoxed. Luckily, I asked this question, "Tell me about your grandparents." And boom, she drops the bomb. Her grandmother was an alcoholic, the father's mother. And she was driving the car drunk. And Grandpa was in the front seat on the passenger side. Grandma hit a pole. She lives. But Grandpa went through the window and got cut, lacerated on the glass, and bled to death before the ambulance arrived. And in that moment, both of us, our mouths dropped open. Because in that moment, we made this connection. When she cuts herself, it had something to do with her grandfather bleeding to death because she almost bleeds to death. And when she said, I don't deserve to live, well, that's obvious. Who would have felt that she didn't deserve to live?
Right, the
for
grandmother.
taking,
Right.
another life, especially the life of her beloved.
Right.
So here I am, and I'm already a student of psychodrama 30 years ago, back then. So I put 2 chairs out in the room, and I said, Sarah, now she never met these grandparents. The father died when the dad was 12, and the mother died of alcoholism when the father was 20. So she never meets them, and I have her visualize her grandfather and grandmother out on the floor on these 2 chairs. And I said to Sarah, tell your grandfather what you do. Well, I cut myself. Tell him how deeply you cut yourself. And she said, Grandpa, I almost bleed to death. And I said, tell him like you did, Grandpa, the way you bled to death. And at this point, she's crying and has her eyes closed. She's visualizing her grandpa. And I said, what are you seeing? What's he telling you? What's happening? She says, he's telling me he doesn't want me to do that. And when I have the urge to cut, the impulse to cut, to feel him there, and he'll be with me, supporting me. And I'm thinking, wow, you can't even
Script
imagine.
that. Yeah.
Right, script that. Right. And then I said, tell your grandmother the same thing. Tell her what you told me. Grandma, I told him I deserve to die. Tell her that's what you would have felt, Grandma. And again, she's crying, and she feels the grandmother with her, and she never cuts again. What happens is she goes home, and as she tries to cut, she feels the support and love and care and the potency, the power of being comforted and supported in these times where she's feeling anxious, what she's carried in through her father. So I don't stop there. I have her bring her father in. I do the same thing with him. I put the chairs out because I know that the father is the doorway, in a sense, the linchpin. This is unresolved in him, and thus it comes, cascading forward. So the father, the story was, he hated his mother because she killed his father. And he can't grieve his father because every time he thinks of the father's death, it's too gruesome, and he goes into the anger toward his mother. So the grief is blocked. So I asked this question without even knowing what I would invent later, which was a system healing inherited trauma. I asked him this question, tell me what happened behind your mother that made her drink. And he said, oh, well, she was put in foster care when she was 3. And I looked at him and said, well, of course she would drink. She was missing the care, the attunement, her attachment, the dopamine in her reward motivation circuitry from a mother who would give her away. So he all of a sudden begins to have compassion for his mother rather than anger and hatred and rage. And he starts to heal it there in the session. Well, I have his daughter, Sarah, sitting over on the side watching. And then I have him grieve his father, open his heart to his mother, and it was an amazing session. He now has parents where before he had nothing. And he stands up after the session, guys, and he stands up, faces Sarah, and says, you leave this with me. I've got this. I mean, you can't script healing better. And so she's over, and this is 30 years ago, and this opened my eyes and my mind to, wait a minute, something's going on in the generations we need to look at, and we need to heal in each generation so it doesn't pass forward. And then began to develop a method for how to unearth inherited trauma, how to detect it, how to heal it, how to work with it. I wrote my book for 2 reasons. One, because I wanted to create awareness of why we suffer, why we struggle, why we walk around with a mystery we can't explain. Anxiety that begins at age 30, anxiety after we get married, feeling trapped or depressed as soon as we get married or get pregnant, moving to a new place. In other words, we have these triggers that happen, but we never connect them. And so I wrote the book for that reason, but I also wrote the book as a manual for therapists who wanted to learn how to work with their clients. So,
Oh, wow.
I did two things and it worked, which was crazy. My dream was when I see this book in an airport bookstore, then I'll be fulfilled. And that's what I did. Every time I would fly, there would be my book, its bestseller, and it would be in airports. And I knew that people reading it who knew nothing were getting something out of it, and therapists could use it. So that was
That's
my
amazing.
goal.
That is amazing.
That's amazing.
I'm wondering how much of when I was listening to that story, the father subconsciously, you said they had he was a good father. They had a good attachment. Sarah had a good attachment with her father, but I wonder how much unconsciously, right, that kind of trauma
Brilliant.
came through,
Right.
without him even knowing,
right.
which fed into Sarah, right?
That's such a good question, Richard. That's such a good insight, because you're right. What is it? What makes these traumas repeat? Why do some people carry it? Why do others not? Why do some people seem to relive, but our brother doesn't, our sister doesn't? What is it about our parents? What's passing forward, even if they were decent parents? What I seem to find, what anchors these traumas, what creates these repetitions, are when the traumas aren't talked about. Or in the father's case, the healing is incomplete.
Yeah.
Because the pain, the grief, the pain was too great. He can't grieve his dad because the anger at his mother is in the way, and the terribleness of the trauma is in the way to grieve. Oh my God, I think of my father, I have to visualize him bleeding to death. And I drink, I get put on the computer, I like something on social media, I go into some,
Some dopamine
mindless
release,
task.
right? Yeah.
Right, some mindless task that give me a dopamine hit because I can't take the pain. So when the healing is incomplete because the pain, the grief, the embarrassment, the shame is too great, we shut it down. And that is one of the mechanisms I see for repetition. Or the people in our family history are excluded or rejected, and there's not been any resolution. Then aspects of these traumas can show up in later generations. And unconsciously, we'll repeat the pattern or we'll share a similar unhappiness until the trauma finally has a chance to heal. I mean, Freud observed this over 100 years ago when he talked about repetition compulsion. He said that traumas repeat for the opportunity of a good outcome.
Right. For healing,
so they have a chance to heal.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing. I think that the contraction of the trauma ultimately contains inside the seed of expansion. So the contractions will repeat and repeat and repeat until we have the right environment, the right opportunity to heal, to expand.
Yeah.
And when you say that, the right opportunity to heal and expand. So, and you also talked about earlier, kind of a daily practice in that. So after this, Sarah, her father, what next? And I mean, because that in and of itself sounds like a healing to me, but is there then,
Yes.
is there more, I guess?
Yes, there is. So let's go to the baseline. What's important? The idea is we want to pull trauma. Trauma really, but pull traction, pull energy away from our limbic brain,
Okay.
away from our limbic system, and our overactive amygdala, which we know is twice the size in those of us who've had significant trauma, and we want to begin to bring engagement or bring energy to the forebrain, specifically the prefrontal cortex, where we can integrate these new positive experiences and our brains can change. So these positive experiences, they can be, and I talk a lot about this in the book, but they can be practices of receiving comfort or support like Sarah did. She goes to cut, which is she's dissociating, and in those moments, she has the wherewithal to say, wait a minute, rather than cut, I'm going to go back to that experience I had and feel grandma and grandpa loving me, supporting me. So that's what she did. And I teach that to people as well. But there's other practices, there's other positive experiences. We can practice feeling compassion compassion for ourselves, like the father did, compassion for his mother that she was given away at 3. So of course she was an alcoholic. He started to develop a practice of compassion. Oprah has always told us to have a gratitude practice. Well, she was right. Because again, gratitude, generosity, compassion, a generosity practice, loving kindness practice, mindfulness, ultimately anything that allows us to feel strength or peace or joy or wonder or curiosity or awe, because these types of experiences, they feed the prefrontal cortex and can help us reframe that trauma response. They can help us reframe that stress response so it is a chance to calm down, it is a chance to downregulate.
Yeah, all those
I mean,
practices.
we know from mindfulness studies that practicing mindfulness actually shrinks the amygdala and thickens the prefrontal cortex.
Right. Yeah, so all those practices of visualizations, the healing sentences, all those things, it detangles everything, right? I mean, that's what we're trying to do.
Brilliant. That's exactly right. You know, you're exactly right. When we visualize, we heal. We don't have to do something in real life. Sarah didn't have to have grandparents alive to heal. She visualized this communication with them, and the brain, the same regions of the brain when we visualize, the same neurons activate as though it's happening in real life. So we don't realize how powerful visualization actually is. It's the same as experiencing something and realize, hey, the brain doesn't care where the healing comes from. It just wants the healing. Basically, to put it in a nutshell, we need to practice being with the uncomfortable sensations in our body.
Yeah.
Being with them until we can reach what's beneath them. The sensations that we experience as life-giving.
Yeah.
Sensations like pulsing, tingling in my chest, spreading, softening in my belly, expanding. I can feel my energy expanding. Oh, I can feel my blood flowing. I can feel waves of energy. That's cool. I can feel warmth filling my body when I do this practice. And then we need to hold those positive sensations for at least a minute and do it 6 times a day, the scientists tell us. That can be enough to change our brain and calm our stress response. But, you know, we're the ones that have to take time to have these positive experiences and then let these positive experiences mean something. They have to affect us. We have to trust that what we're doing feels right.
Comes up time and time again on this show where we're talking about you've got to embrace whatever that really is. That I don't know if it's awareness or that confrontation of reality. I don't know I'm struggling with how to describe it, but it comes up time and time again. You got to get comfortable with that to get to that point. To get to that point, right? To get to the positive step. I gotta confront what the reality is, right? Or the trauma. Am I saying that right?
Because inside you're saying it perfectly. So there's a reality or an experience or a situation out here. And that creates in me a reactivity. So that creates a rapid heartbeat or a tightening or a feeling of nausea or a feeling of disgust in our stomachs. And we have to learn to be with that.
Yes.
So when we stay with those feelings that are uncomfortable, there's something beneath it that we never get to because we're too busy running from what's uncomfortable. But if we can stay with it, we go, wait a minute. Just by staying with it, it sort of melded into this experience of breathing better.
That's right.
Or my heart beating. And that, instead of being a tense sensation, is actually a nice sensation. Here's my heart beating. It's pumping blood and oxygen and glucose and the hemoglobin through my body.
Yeah, the sitting with it is actually that's what comes up time and time, and something I've been so trying to work on over the last decade is getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, because sitting with it leads you to the significance is what I'm trying to say.
So the other night, I ate some food for lunch, felt heavy in my belly, didn't sit well, right? But I read Dr. Hawkins' book, Letting Go, right? And so I'm trying to practice this. I'm like, anytime I feel uncomfortable in my body, I'm just going to breathe into it. I'm going to feel it and just feel it, right? Instead of trying to run from it. So I've been doing this for about, 30, 60 days, something like this. So the end of the night, I'm laying in bed after my stomach didn't feel too well. And finally I was like, you know what? I got to actually try to do these things that we've been talking about. Right? And so I'm sitting there, I'm feeling it, and I'm just laying there. And then all of a sudden I'm feeling the gut itself below the stomach. It was actually below the stomach. And for some reason I reached over, I grabbed a pillow, and I kind of hugged this pillow to kind of try to get comfortable. And the minute I did, the memory came back of like napping with my mom. I'm like 4 years old, and she's there, and she's holding me, and I'm napping. And I was just searching for that feeling of being comforted and safe and not to have to worry. And I linked back with that memory. And as I did, then the pain, it subsided, right? It let go. And then there was kind of this just space of, and it wasn't really emotional. It wasn't like it was heavy, but it was just there that I was like, wow, I wonder how long that stomach thing, that kind of has been down there, just kind of hanging out in my physical body. And I'm just looking for peace, right? Ultimately I was looking for safe when I was feeling like I just want to feel safe again. That's kind of what came up to me. I just want to feel safe again. So, I mean, I think that's kind of what you're kind of in the same vein, right? That there's this stuff that's stored in our physical body, that's stored in our DNA, that's stored in our psyche, that it needs to express or it needs to heal.
Yeah, I have nothing to add to that. It's very well put.
Well, I'm glad maybe I'm getting some of this right.
Yeah, right.
But again,
it speaks to the power of what's happening, what the mind can do. I mean, I'm always amazed. We never fully, we barely scratch the surface. A general layman like myself, of how impactful or influential that our mind can be, or that we do have the power to influence and break the cycles in the chain. That's what I love what you do, the step-by-step guide of again, because on the surface you go, well, why do I even care what happened to me in the past? Because it gives you the awareness to start the healing process. That's why.
Well, and to that point, and something that I've been thinking about throughout this interview and I've thought about a lot as I learn about things and read about things, you have kids, I have kids, our producer Troy has kids. I don't know, Mark, if you have kids or not, but part of it is I feel responsible to pay it or to basically to pass my disease on to them or pass my father's disease on to them. So if nothing else, if you wonder why you should do this type of work, it's like, because your kid, just like in your example with Sarah, right? Sarah didn't do anything. She was the victim, you could say, of a history of her family history. And it's like, for me personally, I look at my own father, he ended up being bipolar, right? Because of he was in foster homes and stuff because his dad was unstable and all of this stuff, right? I got all that fun story running there. But when I look at my dad, he gave me from my perspective, the best childhood I could possibly have with him having bipolar. And so a lot of times I'm like, I don't even have to do the heavy lifting. He somewhere, maybe even subconsciously in my mind, said it stops with me, right? He's trying to stop that dysfunctional mental stuff with him. But I think it's happening at a subconscious level, not a conscious level. And so there's just, I remember when that switched for me to having gratitude for my dad versus having anger or resentment for being bipolar, right? I used to hate him for being bipolar. And then at some point it switched over where I was grateful, I'm grateful he didn't pass that to me, the bipolarism, right? That he kind of held his ground. And so for me now, I have a son, his name's Sam, and my daughter Sophia. I'm like, if I don't do this work, guess what? I'm literally actively passing it to my kids if I know it. Now, obviously, we're, until we have this conversation today, it's not necessarily that concrete. But if I don't do the work, guess who has to do the work? Mm-hmm. My kids, right? It's like, would I actively pass something to my children that I knew was going to? I wouldn't actively pass cancer to my kids, right? That would be horrible. I'd be a horrible parent, right? So I think as with this knowledge and stuff like this comes to light, which is a lot of what we talk about here, trying to bring to the light, if we don't do this work, somebody else has to, and it's going to be our children or their children's children. And it's like, at some point, we just got to take ownership and say it stops with me, right? Yeah. I mean, I know I'm getting pretty passionate about this, but I'm very passionate about it. It's like,
again, very well put.
Yeah,
and you said so many things in there that we could unpack for hours. Guys, we could talk all day. But just the fact that you told me your father was in foster care.
Yeah.
And then you told me your father drank. And then you told me he had gone to war, and that
it was
horrible thing happened.
Yeah, my grandfather was an alcoholic and actually gone to war. My dad was bipolar. And he didn't drink because my grandfather drank. And then, now
Who was
here
the
am I.
one who had gone to war?
My I'm sorry, my
Grandfather.
grandfather.
Your
My grandfather, right. World War
Okay,
II.
so your father, being in foster care, was at war.
Oh,
In foster
fair
care
enough.
is war.
Fair enough. Yeah, he was in a lot of foster
Yeah.
homes in and out.
He's,
Yeah.
he's
had
sent
some-
away from his mom.
Yep.
And that is, that's a break in the attachment, and that's one of the dynamics behind why we drink. But you said so much in there. I don't even know where to begin.
But we don't have to break all that. In fact, actually, in my mind, I was like, I'm just going to have Maria call you and set up a session just for me, because I'm like, I feel like it was kind of, I joked before the podcast, this was an intervention for me, but in some ways it feels like it was an intervention just for me. So, but yeah, I think, back to, that's why it's important to do this stuff. It's not, it's affecting us. We know it's affecting us now, but we don't want it to affect others in our lives. It's obviously affecting spouses. It's affecting coworkers. It's affecting our friends, right? Because these patterns are playing out in us. We can't help but run these patterns until we recognize them and identify them, right? And do something with them.
Oh yeah.
What do you?
I mean, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just gonna say, what do you say if, like, I was adopted? I knew I had a great childhood, and I knew who my.
This is an intervention today. I did not know that about Richard. This is getting deep. We may be here for the rest of the day.
I always knew I was adopted. It wasn't those. I didn't grow up going, "Who are my real parents?" It was never. It was never a big
this is a good
deal.
question,
But I did meet my birth parents, and just a side note, if you ever hear Jimmy Buffett's song, harmonica in a Jimmy Buffett song, that's my birth father. So just so that
Is that right?
That's right.
Wow.
I got tons of stories about meeting Jimmy Buffett and all that other stuff. Anyway,
Wow.
that's a whole nother podcast.
That's just a podcast between you and I
That's
right
right.
there, right?
But what if I don't know? I guess where I was going with this
your
is, like,
biological.
what if I don't know
Well, and
my family history?
And I was wondering that too, like if your parents have died, or obviously grandparents have died, or what what happens then?
So that's again, a great question. And that's what I talk about in the book. I teach people how to become detectives of this trauma language. And because this trauma language is essential, even if we don't know what happened, even if we don't know, our parents don't tell us, they're gone, they're deceased, we're adopted. This information lives in our trauma language. It lives in our fears. It lives in our unexplained symptoms. It lives in our self-destructive or self-sabotaging behaviors. It even lives in the symptoms of our illness that appears after an unsettling event or shows up at a certain age. We have to look at ages in the family history. Even our relationship struggles, the repeated ways we deal with money and success in relationships, how we treat people, how we let ourselves be treated, the type of dynamics that keep repeating. All of this forms a breadcrumb trail that'll give us a glimpse of what happened in the family history, even if the story's been lost or kept secret, but can help us explain why we feel the way we feel. People always ask me, how do I know? How do I know if I've inherited trauma?
Yeah. That was my question. Is like, what are what are some of the identifying factors to let me know that maybe I'm doing this?
Yeah, no, that's a good question too. We can be born with an anxiety and a depression and never separate it from the events of the previous generation. That's true. But we can also experience a fear or a symptom that strikes suddenly or unexpectedly when we reach a certain age or hit a certain milestone or event in our lives. For example, let's do age first. Age 30 is the age great-grandpa was, or grandpa was, when he fires that flamethrower into the cave. And so there's a shift, a trauma, and a biological shift in grandpa. That can pass forward. So dad at the same age, say 30, can leave the family or
he actually had his first mental break and was institutionalized for the first time. So just so we're
around the same age. Okay, Okay, right. What you just said, Matt, is profound, and I want to take a minute for the listeners to just hear that. So around the same age Grandpa was when he fired that flamethrower into the cave, At around the same age in the next generation, dad has a breakdown and gets institutionalized. So that is a sign, ages. And I want to then talk about events. Sometimes there's certain milestones or events in our lives that are like triggers. For example, as soon as we get married, you guys remember in the book I talked about a woman who, she loved her fiance, adored him, but then she marries him and she feels trapped and she doesn't understand it. She says, I love this guy, but now that I'm married, I feel trapped and unhappy. And I said to her, let's look at your family history. Tell me about your mother's marriage. And fine. Tell me about your grandmother's marriage. She goes, oh, they were both given away in Iraq as child brides at age 9 and age 12 to much older men. And I went, oh, there you go. Of course you feel trapped when you get married. And her mouth drops open, because and what's so interesting, the trauma expressed differently in both sisters. The one sister married a man 30 years older, like the grandmothers, and the other sister refused to get married at all. Another trigger is we can move to a new place. And then suddenly, hey, it can even be around the block. And suddenly we become depressed like our ancestors who were persecuted or forced out of their homeland. Or another one is we get rejected by our partner. And the grief is insurmountable. And it takes us back to a much earlier grief, a break in the attachment with our mom or being adopted even. Or we have a child. And then it's as though this ancestral alarm clock starts ringing inside us. I once worked with this woman. She was consumed with anxiety. She had no idea what it was from. But I said, wait a minute, let's break it down. When did this anxiety start? She said, I don't know. 7 months ago. What happened back then? She said, well, that's when I became pregnant. And I said, so what's the worst thing that will happen if you're pregnant or have a child? She said, oh, I'll harm my baby. And I said, did you ever harm a baby? She said, no. I said, has anyone in the family ever harmed a baby? And she was about to say no. And she said, oh my God, my grandmother, when she was a young woman, she lit a candle and the candle caught the curtains on fire, caught the house on fire, and she couldn't get her baby out. And then she said, but we were never allowed to talk about it. And in that moment, she made the link that she had inherited the terror from her grandmother. And after that, she was able to break the pattern.
Incredible.
Amazing.
Incredible.
Well, I love this whole idea of converting our old fearful history and converting them into images that's going to bring us strength and healing, right? That's what this is all about.
Powerful stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Powerful stuff.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the clock here. I mean, this is amazing. We could talk forever. The book It Didn't Start With You,
Yes.
How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle, which is just such powerful stuff, Mark. You did such a wonderful job. Did we talk about everything that we wanted to
I think we could talk for another
I know we
day and a
could.
half,
We
and
could
then you and I
scratch
could
the
just have our own sessions for the next. It's like, all right, I'll see you in an hour. But but I really appreciate you sharing the information and sharing the work. I think even setting the intention that it not only was for lay people like Richard and I, but also for clinical practitioners to use in their practices. I think that's just an amazing gift that you're putting out there in the world, and just something I'm sure was on your heart to do. And I appreciate you doing that and continuing to pay the work, forward, even coming on the show and just helping people understand that. I mean, I think even just listening to our podcast today could have the ability to help people just, at least have the awareness to lighten a trauma, right? Even just understanding
absolutely.
that it's...
Just
right?
to make the connections,
Right.
That's the idea. We've got to shake the family tree and see what falls out.
Right.
What stories didn't get told? What traumas never healed? What family secrets have been, what was kept silent? We need to ask questions. But just listening to this podcast, I'm sure it's going to bring up some
stuff,
opportunities for healing.
I like that, opportunities for healing. Yeah.
You're doing great work, Mark, and I encourage everyone to get the
Thank
book.
you.
How can people connect with you and learn more about you?
They can catch me on social media, or they can come to my website, Mark Wolynn, WOLYNN.com. On there, sometimes private sessions are available with either me or people I've trained. But also, I have a training that teaches clinicians how to use this work in their practices. I even have people who want to go on a deep dive can take the training, because I make the clinicians go on a deep dive through their own personal work, so they can do it with others. Yeah.
Amazing stuff.
I love it. Doing great stuff. Thanks for coming on the show, Mark. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, guys.
Thank you for your time today.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the Next Level Method podcast. If you found some value in this, tell somebody about the show. Tell your friends, tell your spouse, tell your kids, let them know all about Next Level Method. And go to nextlevelmethod.com to learn more and join our community. Thanks for tuning in.